talk quietly amongst yourselves for a moment. Like I said, very smoothly, we've been talking about the shape of Mark's gospel. And because of Mark is a gospel of action, his narrative conveys something that is also shows up in Matthew, Luke, and John. But in Mark, we get the some of the core features of what we think about when we think of the gospel. So we talked about immediately is a transitional marker for several narrative scenes. This language does show up in the other gospels, but specifically a textual pattern. So I think this is not only a stylistic feature of Mark, but also, just something that Mark does when he writes, but I think he has a particular reason for that. He's conveying the sense of motion. And so I want us to look at this technique here. This in particular, this sense of action and motion, we kind of were hitting at this last Wednesday, is that Mark is often tagged as a kind of a quick historical overview, kind of getting to the core, but that's not only because this is what he chooses to record historically, but there's a reason why we feel that way about Mark, and it's part of Mark's compositional strategy to convey that idea. So I want us to talk about story time versus narrative time. Narrative time or narrated time. This does sound like story time with Mark. Story time is fun. Here we're talking about the amount of time that something actually takes. So in some ways we can think here chronological time of the events being recorded. And then here we can talk about the literary depiction of the portrayal of those events. So you'll see what I mean here in a minute. We'll look at a few examples of this. But this is something to note when you're thinking about narrative criticism or just the shape of narrative, what an author is able to do. I want to keep very close attention on the story time or the chronological amount of time that's being recorded or recounted, and then also the narrative time. And so you'll hear me say, if you've been in class with me, I've talked about textual real estate. So something gets a lot of textual real estate. That's one of the ways to see, oh, the author might be emphasizing this or communicating something about it. Whereas we see this in Genesis 1 through 11, for example. Genesis 1 through 11 recounts many, many years, right? These people are living longer generations, worldwide events. Genesis 1 through 11 records from the beginning of time itself through the ark, the Garden of Eden, Babel. So a long period of time, but within the shape of Genesis, that's actually a very short amount of textual real estate, whereas the chronological amount of time in Genesis 12 through 50, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their sons. That's only a few generations, but in terms of the Pentateuch, the book of Genesis, you get a chapter after chapter after chapter on one or two individual generations, whereas you only get 11 chapters on the history of the world up to that point, right? So the relationship between story time and narrated or narrative time. I don't know whose hand came up first.
I was going to ask if you could read the parenthesis next to narrative time because I can't read it.
Are you trolling me, or can you really not see it? Okay, well, I have to ask with you, Tim. Okay, this says literary depiction of the portrayal of those events, right? Portrayal, right? You want me to draw you a portrait of it? Yeah, I know. I'm just kidding, but I want to switch it up here a little bit. different sides of the board. It makes it more exciting, right? Sometimes I'm over here, sometimes I'm over here. But yeah, so literary depiction of the portrayal of these events. So the events themselves, how long they take, and then how long it takes for that narrator to communicate that. Tim knows I love him, so that's one of the reasons that I so,
when you say textual real estate, you're referring to like specific sections that an author gives a lot of
Yeah.
words about one spot. So how would you define that in your own words, textual real estate?
textual real estate. Those are my words. The amount of narrative that's devoted to a particular event. So there's the real estate of the textual real estate is the the plot of land that the book is, how much of that is given to a particular thing. So for example, like if you had 100 acres and your house was on one of those acres and your driveway was 99 acres, you say, well, oh, well, you really appreciate the drive, right? Because your house is only on one of those acres, but you've devoted 99 acres to the driveway. So if an author was depicting this and only spent 5 minutes or 5 chapters of 100 chapters on an event, but there was 95 leading up to that event, then you might say, well, this is important because we get here because it's in a prominent place, but the author's trying to communicate something about the importance of the lead up, right? So that's kind of what I mean. It's kind of a spatial metaphor that, because I also want us to think about this here. A lot of times I communicate this by drawing blocks. So if we're thinking about the shape of the Gospel of Mark, this would be the textual real estate. So how much textual real estate does the cross get in the final 7 weeks of Jerusalem? And that's actually a good segue to what we're going to talk about here, what we started to talk about last time. So geographic structure of Jesus' ministry, we do get, we get the full spectrum of his ministry. We get preparation for ministry, the ministry in Galilee that he did, the approaching crisis, teaching in Jerusalem, and then his suffering, death, and resurrection in Jerusalem. So then some initial observations is that this condensed selection of narrative material allows Mark to generate unique and literary effects. And one of the ways he does that is here. So at the macro level, we talked about the basic structure, perhaps reflects the teaching of Peter and the apostles, where I looked at this. When Peter, go read Peter's preaching of the gospel before he starts to try to preach the gospel, and this is when the Spirit interrupts him. And the shape of that, in the beginning of his ministry, baptism through Galilee, all the way up through Jerusalem, and teachings along the way. It was like, man, I wish we had a full gospel of that. It's like the Gospel of Mark fills that need for us. And in such a brief narrative, there's considerable textual space. This is our textual real estate point that's devoted to the final week in Jerusalem. So there's an emphasis on the cross. The emphasis of the cross is a feature of Mark's compositional strategy. So this is a good example of what we've been talking about. This relates to the final 7 days in Jerusalem, right? This much of the narrative. So roughly half of the narrative starts moving towards Jerusalem. And then when you're looking at the last 7 days, the final week of Jesus's life, think about the amount of space in the narrative, how many chapters, and this is what I mean by textual real estate. The cross gets, either you're talking about the cross, starting to move towards Jerusalem, that final week in Jerusalem, or the actual crucifixion and death is roughly the center here. And then there's this move towards Jerusalem, right? And the cross and resurrection. So if we're looking at the amount of time that relates to the approaching crisis that shows up in Jerusalem, when Jesus is actually in Jerusalem and his suffering, death, and resurrection, that's roughly half of the book. So we can think of Mark 1 through 8, and then chapters 9 through 16. If we haven't thought of the book as a whole, we might miss this. because we're thinking, oh, this is just this section of the gospel. When you're thinking about Jesus' ministry being roughly 3 years, and so here we get 2 years minus 7 days in this section of the gospel, and then here you get roughly a whole half of the gospel focused on a couple weeks. So that tells you that it seems like this is an emphasis, it's underlined, Jerusalem. Look at all these textual indicators I got. A bracket, underlined it 3 times. Jerusalem is being emphasized, the cross, what happens here. So this is one of the reasons why Mark, all the other gospels, but in particular Mark, are sometimes called a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Passion relates to suffering, the Latin word for suffering. The passion narrative, the suffering of Jesus, is the focal point, and then you just have a long introduction to it. So I think more, of course, is going on in the Gospels. But the compositional shape of Mark in particular, because he focuses on events and he's moving so fast, it gets this, it gives you this feel. So using these categories, how would you describe what's going on in Mark? Just by way of summary. How do these categories help you see what's going on in the shape, help you see the shape of Mark's gospel? Andrew?
Mark uses a lot of narrative time, not so much story time.
Oh yeah, well, in some ways, if you're telling a story, you have to use both in that sense. But as Andrew is pointing out, Mark focuses a lot, he uses a lot of narrative time, a lot of textual real estate or narrative time on a smaller part of the actual story. And he's highlighting this. So 7 days get 8, 9 chapters, right? So these categories help us see this. When we note this as part of the shape of narrative, these are the categories, the tools that we're using.
Maybe that Mark is writing essentially an account of that week, and the first 8 chapters are not like just introductory, but that they're like giving context. So like, hey, so we're going to talk about this week where this guy Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Mm-hmm. But like, here's why it's important. Like, here's who this guy was. Like, here's some context to go.
Yeah. So in a sense, seeing this, it helps us see there's an emphasis on the resurrection, the suffering, the death of Christ. There's an emphasis on the cross. But so we can say, oh, there's this huge textual real estate. But if you're thinking of this is the most important thing that he wants to talk about in 7 to 10 days, well, then this all of a sudden now this seems like a long time. So it would be both communicating that the actual suffering and cross of Jesus is really important, but also something about the way that leads up to this is also important. So yeah, it helps us see both directions. One, we see an emphasis, but then if Mark devotes 8 chapters to what leads up to that, then this must be significant as well, right? That's like the example I gave before of 100 acres. And, if the house was 99 acres of that and there was only 1 acre as a drive up, you say, oh, well, this isn't as significant as this other. But if there was, a large portion of the narrative that's involved in Jesus' ministry in Galilee, the misunderstanding of the apostles, for example, then something is also being communicated that we need to draw together as we're thinking about the theology of Mark's gospel, theology of the narrative. And so these tools also help us see, a lot of times when we're thinking about narrative, we're thinking about Mark as a historian. He's given us this accurate record of Jesus, but I want us to think of Mark as much of a theologian as the author of John, whereas who's very clearly, if John is pigeonholed, he gets pigeonholed as the theologian of the Gospels, and Mark is the historian because he just gives us, just the facts, man. But so there's an insight from historiography that you never just give the facts, Naomi. But you know what I'm talking about? This is an old Dragnet, this old detective show, and they were, detectives like, when did so-and-so get murdered? And then she starts telling a story about, how they grew up together. It's like, no, just the facts, ma'am. We don't need any of that. Okay, that's where that phrase comes from. I'm all about just dropping random knowledge bombs today. But you're never just giving the facts, right? So you're always, well, what is most important to say about this thing, right? So even if Mark really was only a historian, he would still be communicating something about what he chose to include in his narrative. But we want to see as a biblical author, but also as what Mark is doing in the way that he's positioning his gospel is profoundly theological. So if you devote half of the gospel to the cross, you're communicating something theologically in the way that you depict this account. Okay, so one of the ways that you can see that is this broad emphasis, but something else that helps us see this is we see this on a macro level, but we can also see this on a micro level. So this emphasis on, we're going to look at here in just a minute, the first 15 verses, 1 through 15, we get, so let's just look at chapter 1 let's just look at chapter 1 here, the Gospel of Mark. And what do we get here? We get John, we get Jesus, of course, Jesus' baptism. And what else do we get in these first 15 verses? Right after the baptism, we get the temptation, which is 40 days, right? So Mark, in 15 verses, has given us quite a bit of narrative events very quickly, right? And so as you're reading chapter 1, in the first 15 verses, you get 40 days at least and more. And then the rest of the chapter, in verse 16 through 45, we get a single day. Mark's like, better is one day. Right here. One day. 16 to 45 is a single day in the life of Jesus. Verses 1 through 15 is at least 40 days. Right? So something is going on. So here again, using the amount of time this actually took, 40 plus days, and the amount of time this actually took, one day, 24-hour period roughly. You can see that Mark, one of the ways that we see that this is a compact sequence is how he slows it down. So here, Mark has gone from the bullet train to the slow motion account, right? And we're just following along Jesus. What did he do in the morning? What did he do in the afternoon? What did he do in the evening? And then this morning again before we move on and the narrative pace picks up. So if you're going at a breakneck speed in Mark, and then all of a sudden it spans out to a single day, so what could possibly be going on? So here you see, let's just look at it. Jesus' summary statement about preaching the gospel. He gives a summary statement, and then the day starts in verse 16. And all of this takes place in one day. As he was going along, this is verse 16. As he was going along the sea, he called Simon and Andrew. This is where he talks about, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Verse 18, immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little further, so the transitions in this particular passage are connecting this narrative sequence. He sees James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were also mending his nets. Immediately he called them, and immediately they followed him. Verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began teaching. So the idea here is he calls the disciples, and then he goes into the synagogue and begins teaching. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then, right, so there's this like immediacy to this section of the narrative. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, what business do you have with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Verse 26. Or 25, he says, be quiet and come out of him. Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed. So they debated amongst themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Verse 28. Immediately, the news about him spread everywhere into the surrounding districts of Galilee. So it kind of gives you a snapshot of the effects of this, but then it zips us back into that same day. And immediately after they came out of the synagogue, right, so it locates it back in that same day, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Peter's mother, or Simon's mother-in-law, was lying sick with this fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her. And he came up to there and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on them. When evening came, so this is still the same day, when evening came after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all those who were ill and were demon possessed. So this is quite a day that's being directed here. And the whole city had gathered by the door. He healed many who were there. He was not, this is going to be something we talk about on Wednesday. He was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. So Jesus is silencing the demons and telling them not to tell who he was. In the early morning, so again, to note here that we're still on the same day, roughly. This has happened, and then the evening came, and then they entered a house, and then the morning came. While it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went to a secluded place to pray. And then they go find him, of course, and then everyone is looking for you. And they went into their synagogue throughout all Judea, preaching and casting out the demons. So again, it kind of blurs here at the end, but there's a few texts where Mark shows the ripple effects of what this happened. And these people went out and then zips us back to this particular day. Then he cleanses the leper. He sternly warns them and immediately sends them away. So the implication there is I think he warns them not to tell anyone. And verse 45 is kind of coming to the end. But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the news around him, such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter the city, but stayed out in the unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. And then verse 1 of chapter 2, when he had come back to Capernaum several days afterward, it was heard that he was at home. So we get this sense that it's a really interesting thing that Mark does. Here we have one day in Jesus' life, and then at strategic places, we see the effects of what has happened, right? He'll give us an indication of kind of a summary statement of things that happened afterwards, that people went out and proclaimed this word about Jesus. Jesus did this, right? Jesus said this, right? Spread out throughout all Galilee in this area. So a few times he's done that, kind of projecting the future. So Mark is going to just move us through the narrative so quickly. And one of the ways that he's done this is he's very clearly condensed some of these events at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and then give us a day in the life of Jesus. So if you're thinking about what was a day of the life of Jesus, Mark gives us what a typical day in Jesus' ministry was look like. And this is interesting because he's only going to give us 7 more chapters of what Jesus' ministry was like before that last week in Jerusalem. But one of the ways Mark does this is he expands. Think about if he's going so fast. We talk about Mark being a gospel of action, going so quickly. Well, here, it's a very different thing that he's doing. We're going quickly through a single 24-hour period, roughly. So in that sense, we are crawling. So Mark is taking us on a bullet train and then put us on the back of a donkey, right? Okay, go to Xenia. Okay, that's going to take me 10 minutes. Do it riding a donkey, right? Okay, this is going to take me all day, right? Well, you're going to notice the trees. You're going to be, cold. You're going to be angry because you got put on the back of a donkey. All those things. So all that to say, there's an effect here, and it is also helping us answer because Mark is going to take us through these things that happen. Jesus says this, and he runs into people that have heard of him, or he runs into people, runs into conflict. You're thinking, well, where did that come from? Well, Mark is giving us this answer. As Jesus is going day to day, word about him is spreading throughout the areas where he is, which helps us explain some of the fast action sequences that we're going to get later in this way. So all that to say that the narrative artistry here is really interesting because of how much happens there. We get interaction with the demon. We get Jesus as healer. We get Jesus as prayer. going by himself in prayer to the Father. All of these kind of communicating themes that will show up in the rest of the gospel. So if you're thinking you're doing a study of the Gospel of Mark, read carefully the entirety of chapter 1, and then note how many of the themes that you see developed in the rest of the gospel are present here at the beginning. Just like we've looked at with Matthew is doing that very clearly, Luke does that for sure, John does that. But I would submit to you, if you're thinking of Mark as a theologian and a author, Mark is doing that as well by the way that he does this. So there's something that I want you to note. There will be a question on this on the final, so that we see 40 days roughly here, and then we see 1 day here. So thinking about what Mark is able to do in his narrative. He's not only going fast, he's also going remarkably slow. So he knows how to hit the pause button. He also knows how to hit that slow-mo button, on YouTube, where you can change the speeds, right? If you're tired of listening to the class sessions we do on Friday, double time. I like me better in double time anyway too. And thinking about noticing those details, and then noticing how an author is utilizing small and large details in order to paint a scene for us. So I think that's part of, because we'll come back here, look again, this is how much of Mark is taking place in the dark. Why is Mark noting it was dark outside? What would be the point of that? So the last thing that we're going to do in Mark is going to think about this pattern of light and darkness in the gospel. But even here you see, why would it be significant that he's telling us, and then the daytime, and then in the morning and the evening? One of those ways, that's the means by which we see that this is 1 day, right? As we're moving forward, he's not just pulling together events here. He's communicating. In this case, I'm giving you the details of a particular day, right? Yeah. So we see this in this is one example of this technique that's going on in Mark. Mark does not include lengthy discourses. That's Matthew's thing, but he does twice. So you'll want to know where the large discourse sections are in Mark's gospel. In chapter 4, we get a lengthy discourse of the parables. This is one of the major discourse blocks in the Gospel of Mark. And then the biggest block of discourse is in chapter 13, where we get in Jerusalem right before Mark 13, we get, this is Mark's discourse, Jesus' discourse on his mini apocalypse, where we get the discourse on the end, what will take place at the end of days. Right, so here we have a gospel. So it would be false to characterize Mark as only a gospel of action, and maybe this isn't his thing. Maybe he didn't have access to long speeches, or maybe he wasn't good at capturing large speeches. Maybe he didn't want to include them. Well, he did, but he strategically highlights 2 places, the parables in chapter 4 and the discourse about the end. So when you're reading a narrative that typically condenses things, those moments where the author chooses to slow down and include large blocks of discourse, it actually heightens those, right? So it gives, within the shape of Mark's gospel, Jesus' speech here and here, or his discourse, these discourse sections stand out in a way that they don't in other gospels. So it tends to highlight it. So why would you, knowing that Jesus is speaking and teaching large speeches all throughout his ministry, why would Mark choose to give us this one right here? And we've talked a little bit about this. One of the reasons is, I think, in light of the short ending or the real ending, or just the end, plain old ending in 16:8, in the close context of this is Jesus is talking about the end, but he's also talking about the kingdom of God. And then also the parables are also about the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. So this is one way to see what Mark is doing, Mark is up to. You see, okay, here are two major discourse blocks. Well, what is going on in these discourse blocks, right? Discussion about the kingdom here and now, and the kingdom to come, right? So you have this emphasis. But think about this here. Even as we see it at this point, the last thing that you get right before you go, Jesus is arrested and crucified and on trial. We already see Jesus speaking about what will take place in his role in it here at the end, future kingdom come. All right, so this creates a dynamic in Mark's gospel. Chapter 14 is the trial, where it's like, well, Jesus, in one sense, we're following along. What is happening to Jesus is up in the air. This is a very dramatic scene. The Son of God is about to die. But the Son of God has also just told us about the Son of Man who is going to come on the clouds, right on that day. So it creates a dynamic between Jesus' impending death and Jesus' impending kingdom that's coming, right? Both of those are coming. So at this point in the Gospel of Mount Mark, Jesus has been talking about what's about to happen in Jerusalem. He's about to die. But here he starts to talk about when he will come in power, right? So it creates this dynamic that we sometimes take for granted about. This is just as we're thinking about the cross, this is just why it's so significant. That expectation and our understanding of the cross and what's going on in Jerusalem are being shaped by Mark's textual strategy here. So these are some of the things that we see, and all of this is made possible by Mark's textual strategy of portraying the narrative in a particular way. Okay, so as we're thinking about the development of themes in Mark's gospel, I want us to think about them in light of this structure. So when we see, as you're reading and rereading Mark in the future, take note of where you're at in the gospel, because this is being emphasized in a particular way. So as we're thinking about the theology of Mark, one of the things that he does is give us a theology of the cross, not by giving us a lengthy discourse by Jesus himself on the cross, but by giving an account of Jesus' entire ministry that focuses on those last 7 days in Jerusalem. So any questions? So here we've talked about, one, the shape of the narrative of Mark. What is the shape? What does it feel? But then also some of the strategies that Mark is using as an author in order to render these. So using kind of our textual analysis, we've kind of highlighted and recognized, oh, this is a different type of text in Mark's gospel. And that's what helped us see, okay, now I can start to think about what's the relationship between these. So if you're still looking for a passage to do your project on, for example, well, what about the parables? And then just ask, where do the parables show up in Matthew? Where do they show up in Mark? You can anticipate what's coming next. Where do they show up in Luke, right? That's your answer, right? That's a synoptic issue. It's like, well, then you're going to notice, oh, some of the parables that show up in Mark 4 also show up in Luke, the end of Luke. And they also show up at different places like Matthew 13. So what effect does it have to think through that particular parable, or those parables as writ large, here and at those different places in the gospel, the shape of the narrative? What about when Jesus talks about the end, his major discourse? Well, in Mark, it's one of the only major discourses, and it shows up in Mark 13. In Matthew, it shows up in Matthew 24 and 25. It's longer, it does different things, and it's the last of a series of major discourses, right? So that would be another interesting study as you're thinking about, well, what is the difference between what Matthew is doing and what Mark is doing with this discussion of the end? And then you're thinking of same thing. Luke has some of this content in his gospel, but it shows up in a different way, right? So there you would need to grapple with unity and diversity of the material, the shape of these gospels. You would have to be grappling with the synoptic issue of here's some of the same content, but it shows up in different places. And then also intertextuality, the use of the Old Testament, because if you're like, well, I don't want to study the Old Testament, I'll just focus on this apocalyptic discourse about the future. Well, I mean, if you're studying those passages, Jesus is constantly making reference to ancient text in order to talk about eschatological future, right? And Mark in particular, it would be ironic if you neglected the Old Testament in Mark chapter 13 because of another editorial strategy where Mark says, hey, dummy, let the reader understand. I'm talking about he's talking about Daniel here, right? He says, let the reader understand. And he's not only talking about the reader of the gospel, which obviously he's talking about, let the reader of my gospel understand that you also need to be a reader of a different text, a different set of texts in that regard. So this is an example that we see show up very clearly in Mark's gospel. Okay, so the last 20 minutes was not only talking about our project, right? Because it's also talking about thinking about the shape, because our project is kind of a capstone of the things that we've been talking about. So just keep that in mind. The type of thing that you're doing in your project is allowing you a chance to put some of these things in practice in the context of our broader discussions. But then also the reverse is true. You can draw on some of the connections we've talked about in class, and you could do some of those things and just kind of tease it out a little further. What would this look like if you were going to do this at the level of the whole? So, all right. Well, on Wednesday, we will start thinking about some of the theological themes. And in particular, we'll ask the question, why does Jesus ask people not to talk about him? So, the messianic secret.